It began in silence, a silence that smelled of salt, diesel and summer wet earth. A silence the size of an ocean and the weight of 1,000 prayers. The landing beaches had been taken, the bloody toe of June had been pressed into Normandy, but beyond the shoreline the campaign stalled. Not at a river. Not at a fortress. But inside the skin of the French countryside itself. The fields were not empty, they were full of traps. Ancient earthen walls, matted hedgerows and sunken lanes turned every acre into a maze where lines of infantry could vanish and tanks could die trying to climb what looked like a gentle hill. This was the hedgerow country, the bocage, and it was rewriting the cost of conquest. On June 6, 1944, the Allies had done what they did best: gather almost everything the modern world could throw at a single day and hurl it against a narrow strip of land. Ships, planes, paratroopers, and steel. They built a promise on the Titline and watched men live or die to carry that promise inland. By June 10, the promise had a problem. The Americans, proud and mechanized, found their Sherman tanks unable to move through the fields. Armor that had rolled across deserts and plains now met with an enemy that was not a gun but a landscape. Walls of living earth that grabbed axles, hit anti-tank guns, and broke momentum into fragments. They called it the hedgerow nightmare. Men who had never seen such a thing before learned a new vocabulary of frustration. Bocage, bank, sunken lane. They learned it in blood. Shermans canted sideways, unable to climb the earthen ramparts. Infantry moving through narrow lanes were funneled into kill zones. German defenders, unseen, were suddenly everywhere. A rifleman behind a bank, a machine gun hidden in a farmhouse, a tank destroyer crouched in the shadows. Every field became a fortress. Offensive doctrine met an ancient countryside and found itself obsolete. Imagine being a young tank commander then, exhausted, coated in dust, the air humming with flies and the stench of cordite. You look out over a field that seems calm, green, even peaceful. But every blade of grass could hide a gun barrel, every tree could mark an ambush. You press the throttle forward. The tank lurches, climbs halfway up the bank, then stalls, its underbelly exposed. In that second, you know you're dead if someone is waiting on the other side. From a distance, the Allied command could see the problem on maps and reports. Up close, among the smoke and clatter of a field repair depot behind the lines, a mechanic named Curtis Culin saw it differently, through the language of metal and leverage. He was 28, from New Jersey. A sergeant in an American armored unit, not an engineer by training but a man who understood machines because he had to. He had the kind of hands that told stories. Scarred knuckles, oil-stained fingertips, the fingerprints of a man used to fixing what breaks. Where others saw a hedge, he saw resistance. Where others saw a bank, he saw an opportunity. The idea was simple, and because it was simple, it was dangerous. In war, simplicity is often treated as heresy. Armies love plans that require signatures, not sparks of imagination. But when doctrine fails and men are dying, sometimes the only salvation is a single, stubborn mind refusing to accept that things must stay as they are. Culin's proposal was reckless. Attach crude steel prongs to the front of the Sherman to cut through the hedgerows, to slice the roots and the soil like a plow cutting earth, letting the tank drive through instead of climbing over. If it worked, the tank would burst through the hedge like a spear of metal, its gun ready to fire. If it failed, the prongs might tear the tracks apart or impale the driver himself. His commanding officer thought he was insane. The engineers called it a fool's dream. But ideas born from desperation have a strange gravity. They linger. They whisper to anyone who's tired of losing men to the same problem. Culin couldn't let it go. He scrounged for scrap metal from German beach obstacles, bits of rebar, sections of mine fencing, whatever he could find. He sketched on the back of an old ammo box, arguing with physics and possibility. He wasn't just welding steel, he was welding hope into a shape. 48 hours later, it was finished. A crude set of teeth, bolted and welded into a heavy frame fixed to the Sherman's hull. It looked like something born from a blacksmith's nightmare, uneven, ugly, jagged. But it held promise. The first test wasn't grand. No generals, no journalists. Just a few men in dusty uniforms, staring at a hedge that had stopped every tank before it. The Sherman rolled forward. The prongs bit into the base of the hedge. The engine roared. And then, the impossible happened. The hedge split, roots tearing like paper. The tank didn't climb. It passed through. It came out the other side steady, its gun level, its crew alive. One soldier watching whispered, "Holy hell, it worked." What does it take to change a war? Sometimes it's not a strategy written in headquarters. Sometimes it's a man with dirty hands and a stubborn idea. Word spread fast. In war, good news travels like fire through dry grass. Soldiers came from other units just to see it. Officers who had laughed the day before stood silent, watching the demonstration again and again, trying to understand how something so crude could solve what maps and theories had failed to. Could it really be that simple? Could a few welded prongs of steel shift the balance of an entire campaign? The next test was under fire. A real battle, a real hedgerow with Germans waiting beyond. The tank rolled forward, the cutter leading the way. The hedge split like wet wood, and before the defenders could react, the Sherman was through, its cannon blasting, its treads grinding into the open field beyond. That moment, brief, violent, and utterly decisive, spread across the front lines in whispers, then reports, then orders. The first working hedgerow cutter had proven itself not in theory but in blood. Men began to improvise. Field workshops welded their own versions. Some were rough, some failed, some succeeded brilliantly. Within days, commanders were sending messages up the chain. We need more cutters. General Eisenhower read the reports. He understood instantly what it meant. Here was something that could restore mobility, something born not from bureaucracy but from necessity. His response was swift and direct. Produce them, 5,000 units, immediately. The order rippled across Normandy. Welding torches lit barns and garages. Crews worked through nights, bending, cutting, riveting. Tank drivers helped bolt the cutters themselves, not waiting for formal instructions. For the first time since D-Day, momentum returned. Each new hedgerow that fell wasn't just an obstacle removed, it was a psychological victory. Soldiers began to feel something they hadn't felt since Omaha: control. They could move. They could fight on their own terms again. Imagine the feeling of being pinned down for weeks, and suddenly your machine could carve through what had once been a wall of death. For those men, the first tank that burst through a hedge was more than steel and noise. It was freedom. The cutter earned its name from the lips of the men who used it, not from engineers or manuals, but from soldiers who trusted results over theory. The Culin device, they called it, though most just called it the Hedgerow Cutter. But there's always resistance to change, even in war. Some officers argued it was too crude, too dangerous, untested. Others feared it might compromise the Sherman's armor. Yet as the battles rolled on and the reports stacked up, the evidence was undeniable. Tanks fitted with the cutters were surviving longer, advancing faster, and breaking through positions once considered impregnable. The bocage was losing its power. Still, invention in war is never just mechanical, it's moral. Every new tool that works doesn't just shift tactics, it changes morale. It changes belief. The soldiers began to look at the landscape differently. What had been a trap became a challenge. What had been a wall became a door. In the middle of chaos, a strange kind of order emerged, the order of innovation. Each tank fitted with Culin's device was not just a weapon, it was a message. A reminder that even amid the vast machinery of war, one mind, one idea, could alter the rhythm of history. By the end of July, Normandy was changing. The fields that had consumed so many lives began to yield. The German defenses, so confident in their hedgerow advantage, were cracking. They could no longer predict where the next tank would appear. What had started as a desperate improvisation by one man had become doctrine. 5,000 cutters spread across France, mounted on Shermans like the jaws of a mechanical beast. One small idea had reshaped a campaign. And somewhere behind the lines, perhaps with a cigarette between his fingers and grease on his hands, Sergeant Curtis Culin might have smiled. Not because he had built something perfect, but because it had worked when nothing else did. He hadn't invented it for glory. He'd done it because he couldn't stand watching men die for lack of imagination. Isn't that what defines real innovation? The courage to act when logic says it's foolish? History often glorifies the generals, the grand plans, the speeches. But in the mud and noise, wars are turned by people like Culin, the ones who fix what others accept as broken beyond repair. Maybe that's why his story endures. Because it's not just about steel or war. It's about defiance. About a belief that no problem, however old or entrenched, is unsolvable. If you've ever faced something that felt immovable, a system, a habit, a wall that wouldn't yield, remember this. In June 1944, a man with no degree, no blueprint, and nothing but conviction found a way through. And that's why history remembers him. If this story speaks to you, if you believe history isn't just about what happened but about what people dared to do when no one believed they could, then stay with us. Subscribe for more stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, what's the hedgerow in your life, and how will you cut through it? The roads of Normandy were narrow veins carved centuries before tanks existed. High banks rose on either side, their roots thick and tangled, their shade cool and deceptive. From above, reconnaissance planes could see the pattern like a patchwork quilt, small fields stitched together by the green seams of hedges. To the eye it looked peaceful. To the soldiers below it was a labyrinth. Every turn might end with a mine, an ambush, or a sudden burst of fire. Through that deadly maze the new Shermans moved like something reborn. The steel teeth on their hulls gleamed dull in the rain. When the engines roared and the tanks drove forward, the hedgerows split open like wounds. Soldiers who had been trapped for weeks suddenly saw tanks appear from unexpected angles, breaking through walls that the Germans had trusted. For the first time since the landings, momentum returned to the Allied side. The enemy was stunned. German gunners had built their defenses on predictability, knowing where the Americans could and couldn't go. The hedgerows were supposed to be nature's ally. But now with Culin's cutters that logic failed. Tanks began emerging from places no one thought possible. Entire platoons would vanish behind a hedge and reappear behind enemy lines, bringing chaos to carefully prepared defenses. Reports flooded command posts. In the confusion of battle, rumors always ran faster than truth. Some said the Americans had developed a new type of tank entirely. Others thought it was a secret explosive or underground passage. But it was neither. It was simply an idea made real, a few welded prongs shaped by persistence and necessity. Culin's device spread not by order alone but by imitation. Field workshops across Normandy began producing their own versions, each slightly different, each crafted from whatever materials could be found. The war had become a forge of invention. One tank carried cutters made from German steel, another used iron bed frames scavenged from abandoned farms. It was messy, improvised, and beautiful in its effectiveness. Every mechanic who copied it felt the same quiet pride. In a world of strict hierarchies, they had done something the manuals had not allowed. They had changed the rules. By mid-July, an army of modified Shermans rolled across Normandy. Some crews painted names on their cutters: Hedgehog, Cowcatcher, Culin's Claws. They treated the crude blades like badges of defiance. And behind them infantry followed, walking through gaps that hadn't existed an hour earlier. The air was thick with the smell of soil and oil. The sound of grinding treads echoed through valleys that had been quiet for centuries. The bocage, once a natural fortress, was crumbling. Still, innovation never comes without friction. For every officer who praised the cutter, there was another who doubted it. Some claimed it gave away the tank's position by noise. Others worried it would weaken the front armor or jam in the mud. There were incidents. A cutter that bent under stress, a prong that snapped clean off, tanks that became trapped halfway through a hedge. But even those failures taught lessons. The design was refined, the welding improved, and the soldiers learned how to use it tactically. Soon a rhythm formed. Tanks fitted with cutters would punch through a hedge, open a hole, then pull aside while others advanced through. Infantry poured in after them, clearing resistance. The cooperation between man and machine grew tighter, more precise. The battlefield was learning to breathe again. Each new hedgerow that fell wasn't just an obstacle removed, it was a psychological victory. Soldiers began to feel something they hadn't felt since Omaha: control. They could move. They could fight on their own terms again. Imagine the feeling of being pinned down for weeks, and suddenly your machine could carve through what had once been a wall of death. For those men, the first tank that burst through a hedge was more than steel and noise. It was freedom. The cutter earned its name from the lips of the men who used it, not from engineers or manuals, but from soldiers who trusted results over theory. The Culin device, they called it, though most just called it the Hedgerow Cutter. But there's always resistance to change, even in war. Some officers argued it was too crude, too dangerous, untested. Others feared it might compromise the Sherman's armor. Yet as the battles rolled on and the reports stacked up, the evidence was undeniable. Tanks fitted with the cutters were surviving longer, advancing faster, and breaking through positions once considered impregnable. The bocage was losing its power. Still, invention in war is never just mechanical, it's moral. Every new tool that works doesn't just shift tactics, it changes morale. It changes belief. The soldiers began to look at the landscape differently. What had been a trap became a challenge. What had been a wall became a door. In the middle of chaos, a strange kind of order emerged, the order of innovation. Each tank fitted with Culin's device was not just a weapon, it was a message. A reminder that even amid the vast machinery of war, one mind, one idea, could alter the rhythm of history. By the end of July, Normandy was changing. The fields that had consumed so many lives began to yield. The German defenses, so confident in their hedgerow advantage, were cracking. They could no longer predict where the next tank would appear. What had started as a desperate improvisation by one man had become doctrine. 5,000 cutters spread across France, mounted on Shermans like the jaws of a mechanical beast. One small idea had reshaped a campaign. And somewhere behind the lines, perhaps with a cigarette between his fingers and grease on his hands, Sergeant Curtis Culin might have smiled. Not because he had built something perfect, but because it had worked when nothing else did. He hadn't invented it for glory. He'd done it because he couldn't stand watching men die for lack of imagination. Isn't that what defines real innovation? The courage to act when logic says it's foolish? History often glorifies the generals, the grand plans, the speeches. But in the mud and noise, wars are turned by people like Culin, the ones who fix what others accept as broken beyond repair. Maybe that's why his story endures. Because it's not just about steel or war. It's about defiance. About a belief that no problem, however old or entrenched, is unsolvable. If you've ever faced something that felt immovable, a system, a habit, a wall that wouldn't yield, remember this. In June 1944, a man with no degree, no blueprint, and nothing but conviction found a way through. And that's why history remembers him. If this story speaks to you, if you believe history isn't just about what happened but about what people dared to do when no one believed they could, then stay with us. Subscribe for more stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, what's the hedgerow in your life, and how will you cut through it? The roads of Normandy were narrow veins carved centuries before tanks existed. High banks rose on either side, their roots thick and tangled, their shade cool and deceptive. From above, reconnaissance planes could see the pattern like a patchwork quilt, small fields stitched together by the green seams of hedges. To the eye it looked peaceful. To the soldiers below it was a labyrinth. Every turn might end with a mine, an ambush, or a sudden burst of fire. Through that deadly maze, the new Shermans moved like something reborn. The steel teeth on their hulls gleamed dull in the rain. When the engines roared and the tanks drove forward, the hedgerows split open like wounds. Soldiers who had been trapped for weeks suddenly saw tanks appear from unexpected angles, breaking through walls that the Germans had trusted. For the first time since the landings, momentum returned to the Allied side. The enemy was stunned. German gunners had built their defenses on predictability, knowing where the Americans could and couldn't go. The hedgerows were supposed to be nature's ally. But now, with Culin's cutters, that logic failed. Tanks began emerging from places no one thought possible. Entire platoons would vanish behind a hedge and reappear behind enemy lines, bringing chaos to carefully prepared defenses. Reports flooded command posts. In the confusion of battle, rumors always ran faster than truth. Some said the Americans had developed a new type of tank entirely. Others thought it was a secret explosive or underground passage. But it was neither. It was simply an idea made real, a few welded prongs shaped by persistence and necessity. Culin's device spread not by order alone but by imitation. Field workshops across Normandy began producing their own versions, each slightly different, each crafted from whatever materials could be found. The war had become a forge of invention. One tank carried cutters made from German steel, another used iron bed frames scavenged from abandoned farms. It was messy, improvised, and beautiful in its effectiveness. Every mechanic who copied it felt the same quiet pride. In a world of strict hierarchies, they had done something the manuals had not allowed. They had changed the rules. By mid-July, an army of modified Shermans rolled across Normandy. Some crews painted names on their cutters: Hedgehog, Cowcatcher, Culin's Claws. They treated the crude blades like badges of defiance. And behind them, infantry followed, walking through gaps that hadn't existed an hour earlier. The air was thick with the smell of soil and oil. The sound of grinding treads echoed through valleys that had been quiet for centuries. The bocage, once a natural fortress, was crumbling. Still, innovation never comes without friction. For every officer who praised the cutter, there was another who doubted it. Some claimed it gave away the tank's position by noise. Others worried it would weaken the front armor or jam in the mud. There were incidents: a cutter that bent under stress, a prong that snapped clean off, tanks that became trapped halfway through a hedge. But even those failures taught lessons. The design was refined, the welding improved, and the soldiers learned how to use it tactically. Soon a rhythm formed. Tanks fitted with cutters would punch through a hedge, open a hole, then pull aside while others advanced through. Infantry poured in after them, clearing resistance. The cooperation between man and machine grew tighter, more precise. The battlefield was learning to breathe again. In the command tents, Eisenhower's officers studied maps covered with arrows. Red, blue, black lines twisting toward Paris. But beneath those lines was a story few of them fully understood. A mechanic's stubborn defiance translated into motion across an entire front. The Hedgerow Cutter had become invisible to the eye, just another part of the machinery, yet its influence shaped every advance. Culin's name surfaced in reports, in small paragraphs buried beneath statistics. He received a commendation, a handshake, perhaps a nod from a superior who understood, at least for a moment, what had been achieved. But the war was not finished, and history rarely pauses to thank those who build while others destroy. In the villages they liberated, French farmers watched the armored columns pass and saw strange blades fixed to the tanks' fronts. They had no idea what they were. To them, these machines looked like beasts of iron with teeth made to chew through their ancient fields. Some cursed quietly, thinking of the fences and crops torn apart. Others wept, understanding that destruction was the price of freedom. The tanks moved east, carving their way toward a new horizon. Behind them lay the ruins of hedges that had stood for centuries, cut down in weeks. Behind them, too, lay the proof that innovation was not a privilege of rank, but a right of necessity. Yet in every victory lies the seed of reflection. For some soldiers, the success of the hedgerow cutters was a symbol of ingenuity. For others, it was a quiet reminder of the war's cruelty, that even nature could be weaponized, even beauty could be cut apart in the name of progress. At night, when the engines cooled and the fields grew silent again, men would sit beside their machines and smoke, staring into the darkness where the hedgerows had been. Some talked about home. Others said nothing at all. The air still smelled of soil and gunpowder. The ground beneath their boots held more bodies than seeds. And somewhere among those men was Curtis Culin, the mechanic from New Jersey, the sergeant who had turned scrap metal into salvation. He didn't see himself as an inventor. He was a soldier who solved a problem because no one else could. He didn't think in terms of legacy. He thought in terms of survival. He wasn't the only one. Across Normandy, in the hidden corners of the Allied machine, others like him were improvising, medics turning ration tins into surgical tools, drivers reinforcing trucks with sandbags, engineers rerouting fuel lines with tape and wire. War has always been a university of improvisation, and its graduates are seldom remembered. But Culin's device was different. It was simple enough to spread, visible enough to symbolize something larger. It spoke to the soul of the common soldier, that quiet, stubborn insistence that no situation is hopeless. The Germans soon realized what they were up against. In reports captured after the war, officers described American tanks bursting through the hedges like water through a dam. Entire defensive positions collapsed not because of overwhelming numbers, but because the element of predictability had been shattered. War, after all, depends on rhythm. Break that rhythm and the enemy loses balance. The hedgerow cutter was rhythm-breaking incarnate. It made every field uncertain, every ambush questionable. It turned a natural defense into a temporary obstacle. The Allied advance accelerated. Operation Cobra had ripped a hole in the German front, and through that hole poured a flood of men, armor, and resolve. By early August the enemy line bent and broke. The bocage, once the great equalizer, had become irrelevant. And yet, as the tanks rolled east and the countryside opened into plains, something else emerged, a question. What would happen when innovation met peace? What happens to the inventions born in crisis when the crisis ends? Curtis Culin's story, like so many wartime stories, began to fade even before the echoes of battle stopped. Commanders wrote reports, historians collected accounts, factories retooled. The world moved forward as it must. But inside the small fraternity of men who had seen his idea work, who had watched hedges crumble before their eyes, his name lived on as legend. Some of them said it changed how they saw everything afterward. That after witnessing a man's idea reshape an entire campaign, they could never again believe that one person didn't matter. Isn't that the heart of it? That conviction, that a single voice, even in the noise of war, can still be heard? Years later, when Culin was asked about his invention, he spoke plainly, as if he didn't quite understand why people made so much of it. "We just needed to get through," he said. So we did. But those words hide something profound. Because in every "we just did," there is the essence of humanity's progress, the refusal to be stopped by what seems immovable. Back in Normandy, the land slowly healed. Farmers replanted. The hedgerows grew again, thinner, patched, scarred. Decades passed, and children played in the same fields where tanks once roared. Nature, patient and indifferent, reclaimed its rhythm. But beneath the soil, fragments of steel still sleep. Rusted prongs, broken bolts, relics of a moment when survival required invention. Tourists visiting today see serenity. But if you listen closely, the air still carries whispers, the echoes of engines, the breath of men who dared to try something unapproved, untested, and utterly necessary. History, when stripped of flags and speeches, is made of moments like that. Small decisions. Brief acts of courage. The spark of a mind refusing to accept defeat. Culin's invention reminds us that war, for all its destruction, also reveals what people are capable of under pressure. In peace we call it creativity. In war we call it survival. And perhaps that's what makes this story so haunting. Because behind every advance, every innovation, there is always loss. Every life saved by the cutter was balanced by another taken in battle. Every hedge cut open was a grave waiting to happen. The triumph of invention cannot erase the tragedy that made it necessary. But it can teach us. When historians write of Normandy, they speak of strategy, of beachheads, of Eisenhower's plans, of Patton's charge. Rarely do they mention the mechanic who welded a piece of steel in a dusty field. Yet without that man, the campaign might have dragged on, the losses might have been greater, the liberation slower. There is a quiet poetry in that truth. The war was decided not only by those who commanded but by those who created. And so, as the Allied forces crossed the Seine and moved toward Paris, the echoes of Culin's idea went with them. Invisible, integrated, unstoppable. It wasn't just about tanks anymore. It was about belief spreading through an army. When men see proof that an impossible problem can be solved, something fundamental shifts. They stop waiting for orders. They start thinking. The Hedgerow Cutter had become more than a tool. It had become permission. Permission to invent, to adapt, to challenge authority when authority was wrong. That spirit is dangerous in peacetime, but in war it is priceless. In every workshop, soldiers began to apply that same energy to other problems. Makeshift bridges, field modifications, armor reinforcements, the ripple of creativity was everywhere. The army was evolving not by command but by example. That's what real leadership looks like, not control but ignition. Curtis Culin never sought to lead, yet through his act he did. He led by showing that ingenuity could coexist with discipline, that thinking differently was not disobedience but survival. And so the question extends far beyond 1944. What would happen if we treated all our obstacles the way Culin treated those hedgerows? Not as barriers but as challenges to be cut through. Because in every life there are hedgerows. Thick, ancient, seemingly unmovable. And every time we face one, we stand at the same threshold he did, the line between resignation and resolve. History in that sense is not past. It's a mirror. We look into it and see our own choices reflected back. In Normandy, one man chose action over acceptance. The result was freedom measured not in miles but in lives. Maybe that's why even now, when you walk through those quiet fields and touch the rough bark of a regrown hedge, you can almost feel it, the echo of courage welded into metal, the ghost of an idea that refused to die. And when you stand there long enough, you might find yourself asking, if he could change the course of a war with scrap metal and determination, what could I change with what I have in my hands today? When the Allied armies broke free from the bocage, the war in Western Europe changed its rhythm completely. For 2 long months, the front had crawled forward inch by inch, hedgerow by hedgerow. Now it began to move like a storm. Tanks no longer hesitated before the green walls of Normandy. They rolled through open country, Engines growling, cutters scarred and dulled but still biting through the remnants of the old hedges that once defined the battlefield. The breakout unleashed speed. American armor surged south and east, cutting deep into the German rear. The countryside that had once swallowed men whole now echoed with the thunder of progress. The sound of victory, however distant, was beginning to take form. But as the front expanded, so too did the cost. Every innovation carries a shadow, and the Hedgerow Cutter was no exception. In the haste of pursuit, tanks often outpaced their infantry. Communications broke down. Supply convoys lagged behind. The same tools that had enabled movement now demanded caution, for speed could turn triumph into disaster if control was lost. In those days, Normandy's beauty returned in strange flashes, golden fields littered with steel, sunlight reflecting on shell casings, the smell of summer fighting with the stench of war. Men who had once seen every hedge as a threat now passed them by without a thought. The bocage had been conquered. But the victory felt heavier than expected. In the villages they liberated, civilians came out to greet the soldiers. They smiled, cried, and offered what little they had. For them, the sight of those modified tanks was something mythical, machines that had broken through the very walls of the land itself. Yet for the crews who drove them, the cutters were simply tools, scarred reminders of everything it had taken to get this far. Sometimes the soldiers would look at the fields behind them and realize how much had changed, not just the terrain but themselves. They had learned that innovation was not a matter of genius, but of necessity. When you are forced to survive, creativity becomes instinct. Culin's idea had traveled faster than he ever could. By the time the Allies crossed into central France, his cutters were everywhere. On tanks in the British sector, in Canadian units, even on vehicles modified by French forces using local scrap. They appeared in photographs, reports, field sketches, and eventually in history books. But for most soldiers, it wasn't an invention anymore. It was just the way things were done. Perhaps that's the greatest compliment any idea can receive, to become so natural that people forget it was once impossible. By September, Paris had been liberated. The city erupted in light, crowds filling the streets, church bells echoing for the first time in years. The tanks rolled through the boulevards, their cutters still attached, dented and rusted from months of use. Civilians didn't know what they were. To them, they were just strange jaws of steel, scars on machines of victory. But to the men inside, they were symbols of survival, reminders of the fields where it all began. Curtis Culin wasn't in Paris that day. He was somewhere behind the lines, working, fixing, doing what he always did. Reports say he received an award from General Bradley for his contribution. Some claimed Eisenhower himself acknowledged the invention in person. But for Culin, none of it mattered much. He wasn't chasing medals. He just wanted the war to end, for the noise to stop, for people to go home. And yet, his small act of creation had already become immortal. The true climax of this story isn't the liberation of Paris or the collapse of German defenses. It's the moment a simple idea becomes something larger than its creator, when it spreads beyond control, beyond recognition, and takes on a life of its own. That's what happened with the Hedgerow Cutter. It began as a sketch on a scrap of metal. It became a movement across an army. It ended as a principle, that adaptability is stronger than rigidity, that imagination is a weapon in its own right. The months that followed were brutal. The Allied armies pushed toward the Siegfried Line. The terrain changed again, forests, rivers, cities reduced to ruins. The cutters were no longer needed as before, yet many remained attached, their jagged shapes a testament to what had been overcome. For Culin, the war ended not with a parade but with silence. When victory came, he packed his gear, turned in his tools, and went home. The world he returned to was peaceful but unrecognizable. There were no hedgerows in New Jersey. No engines idling in fear. Just the hum of ordinary life. He found work again, steady, modest, unremarkable. His story was told in newspapers, then forgotten, then rediscovered decades later by historians tracing the unsung innovations of the war. But perhaps that's how he would have wanted it. Not every hero seeks recognition. Some just want to build something that works and walk away. In time, the Hedgerow Cutter took its place in museums, a small exhibit, a few rusted fragments behind glass. Visitors read the captions and move on. But if they listen, they might hear what those shards still say, that history isn't only shaped by great minds or grand speeches. It's shaped by those who act when others hesitate. That truth has echoed through every war since. In Vietnam, soldiers welded makeshift armor onto their transport trucks. In Iraq, mechanics improvised gun mounts and reinforced Humvees with scavenged steel. In every conflict, the spirit of Culin's cutter has reappeared in new forms under new names. Innovation born from desperation, that is the legacy of Normandy. And yet, there is a darker reflection hidden beneath it. Because every tool of war, no matter how ingenious, serves a purpose that ends in destruction. The same human creativity that builds life also perfects killing. That paradox sits at the heart of progress. We invent not because we love to destroy but because survival demands it. Culin's story asks us to look closer, to see the double edge of invention. His device saved countless Allied lives. But it also allowed the killing to continue, faster, more efficiently, deeper into enemy territory. That is the price of ingenuity in war. Every solution feeds the cycle it seeks to end. So what do we take from it? Pride? Caution? Or both? Maybe the lesson lies somewhere between admiration and unease. Because the same mind that cuts through a hedge can one day build a bridge. The same hands that weld steel for war can later build homes in peace. The question is not whether innovation is good or evil, it is what we choose to use it for. After the war, Culin lived a quiet life. He never patented his design. He never sought compensation. He never turned his invention into industry. In interviews, when asked what drove him, he gave the same answer every time: necessity. We just had to get through, he said again and again. That humility is perhaps the rarest form of genius. He didn't see the moral weight of his idea, or maybe he did and chose silence. Sometimes, the people who change the world are the least willing to talk about it. But history remembers even when people forget. Today, military historians cite the Hedgerow Cutter as one of the most important field innovations of World War II. A small adjustment with massive consequences. Tactical mobility in Normandy improved dramatically after its introduction. Operations that once cost hundreds of lives could be completed in hours. And for thousands of soldiers, those teeth of steel were the difference between dying in a field and seeing home again. Still, when you stand in those fields today, it's hard to imagine what happened there. The wind moves gently through the hedges. Birds nest where shells once fell. The scars of war are buried under layers of peace. But the ground remembers. Beneath the roots there are traces, metal fragments, rusted bolts, the faint geometry of a machine that once carved open the land. Farmers still dig them up sometimes, confused at first, until they realize what they are. A reminder of the days when invention meant survival. If you ever find yourself there, walking the narrow lanes of Normandy, stop for a moment. Listen to the quiet. Feel the earth beneath your feet. Somewhere in that silence, the echo of that moment still lingers. The sound of a tank engine rising, the crack of roots giving way, the rush of air as history itself opens. Because history doesn't fade. It waits. It hides in the soil, in the memory of things built in desperation and used with courage. The hedgerows grew back. The people rebuilt. But the story of the man who cut through them endures. In the end, that's all any of us can hope for, to leave behind something that mattered, something that outlives the noise. Culin didn't change the world with theory or power. He changed it with his hands, with courage, with the refusal to surrender to circumstance. That's what makes his story not just history, but a mirror for every generation. What do we do when faced with walls, not of earth but of doubt, bureaucracy, fear? Do we stop? Or do we, like that sergeant in Normandy, pick up the scraps around us and make something that works? Maybe that's the question every civilization must ask itself. Because progress isn't made by those who wait for orders. It's made by those who dare to weld their own path forward. The war moved east and the world began to forget the hedgerows. Europe was burning, cities reduced to dust, armies bleeding across a continent that seemed to have no end. Normandy, once the center of the world, became a quiet memory, a place that had been conquered, then left behind. But memory has roots just like the hedges that once stopped an army. It grows in silence and it waits for those who care enough to look down. In the years after the war, stories of victory filled newspapers and newsreels. Generals became household names. Statues were raised, parades rolled down city streets, flags waved beneath clear skies. But behind all that celebration lay a quieter truth, that victory had been carried not only by strategy or leadership, but by the stubborn courage of ordinary people who refused to stop thinking. Curtis Culin's name appeared in a few articles, a few speeches. The man who beat the hedgerows, one headline said. For a while that phrase followed him. But time is merciless with its heroes. The spotlight shifted. The world rebuilt, modernized, moved on. And yet, his idea lived on in the invisible habits of the world he helped shape. In every engineer who cuts through red tape to solve a problem. In every worker who refuses to wait for permission to fix what's broken. In every person who looks at an obstacle and sees not frustration, but possibility. That is where innovation really lives. Not in laboratories, not in patents, not in the comfort of conferences or titles, but in the places where the world says, "You can't," and someone replies quietly, "Watch me." History rarely records those moments. But it is built on them. For the soldiers who fought in Normandy, the Hedgerow Cutter was not just a device. It was a lifeline, a symbol of hope when logic offered none. They remembered it in ways no historian could measure, not through numbers, but through the feeling of moving forward again, after weeks of fear and stagnation. Some of them wrote letters home about it. Others simply told the story over beer and smoke, decades later, when their hair had gone gray and the war had turned into memory. They spoke of the day the tanks stopped dying on the banks of the Bocage. The day they broke through. The day they felt the ground itself give way to human will. And they would say, almost with disbelief, "It all started with a mechanic." It's easy to forget that wars are fought not just by armies but by ideas. The Hedgerow Cutter was one of those ideas. Simple, human, imperfect, effective. It didn't change the nature of war, but it changed the nature of that war. And maybe that's all that matters. Because history doesn't need grand revolutions to turn. Sometimes, it pivots on a few inches of steel welded in a barn. After the war, Culin returned home. New Jersey welcomed him with quiet pride. His neighbors called him the inventor, though he never quite accepted the title. He worked. He lived. He aged. And like most men who came back from that storm, he carried its echoes inside him for the rest of his life. He never sought profit or fame. He didn't patent his idea or write a memoir. He just went on living, and maybe that's what makes his story so pure. Because in the end, he hadn't invented something to be remembered. He had invented something so that others could live long enough to forget him. There's a strange kind of nobility in that. In museums today you can still find one of his cutters, rusted, heavy, blunt-edged. It sits quietly behind glass, a piece of forgotten metal that once decided the fate of thousands. Most visitors pass it by. A few stop and stare, trying to imagine what it must have felt like to be in that tank, driving through the green walls of Normandy with death on both sides. They can't. No one truly can. The war has become an abstraction, a sequence of dates and images. But to those who lived it, it was texture, smell, fear, hope, exhaustion. And in that mix, the Hedgerow Cutter was a small miracle. We like to think of history as a story of power. Of generals and kings, presidents and empires. But the truth is simpler and harder. History is the story of people who refuse to stop at walls, whether those walls are made of earth, policy, or disbelief. Culin's story is not about war. It's about that refusal. He reminds us that every great system, every unstoppable machine, can be brought to its knees by a single question: why not? And maybe that's what frightens institutions most, not failure but imagination. Because imagination cannot be controlled. It can be ignored, punished, dismissed, but not killed. In 1944, the world was full of men who followed orders. Curtis Culin was one of the few who looked at a rule and thought, maybe there's another way. And that made all the difference. The hedgerows of Normandy have grown back now, thick and green. Birds nest in them again. Farmers trim them as they have for centuries. Children walk the lanes where tanks once crawled. The earth has healed, at least on the surface. But beneath that quiet skin, history still breathes. Every few years, someone digs up a fragment of rusted metal and wonders where it came from. Some throw it aside. Others keep it, a souvenir of something they'll never fully understand. They don't need to. Because the lesson of that rust is timeless. Nothing stands forever, not even the walls we think can't be broken. When you walk through those fields today, the air is still. The grass moves softly in the wind. It's hard to imagine that once, this piece was bought with fire and invention. Yet, if you listen long enough, you can almost hear it. The echo of an engine starting, the crunch of roots breaking, the sigh of the earth yielding. That's history speaking. Not loudly. Not gloriously. Just steadily in the background, reminding us that every age has its hedgerows, and every age has its Culins. They don't all wear uniforms. Some sit in workshops or offices or classrooms. Some write code instead of welding steel. But the essence is the same. They see what others accept and they cut through it. So the next time you face something that feels immovable, a system too big, a problem too complex, a wall too thick, remember that somewhere in France in the summer of 1944, a mechanic with grease on his hands and no degree looked at an impossible wall and said, "Let's try something." And the world moved forward because he did. That's the quiet power of courage, not loud, not cinematic, but persistent. It doesn't demand attention. It demands action. It's easy to believe that history belongs to the extraordinary. But maybe it belongs to the stubborn instead, to those who refuse to stop thinking, refuse to stop trying, refuse to stop believing that there's a way through. Because when you strip away the myth and the memory, that's all progress really is. People cutting through the hedgerows of their own time. So what are yours? What stands between you and the future you imagine? What wall have you accepted as permanent? Maybe, like Culin, you don't need permission. Maybe all you need is an idea, a few scraps of courage and the will to try. If this story reminded you that change is possible, that history isn't something distant but something we build, one act at a time, stay with us. Subscribe for more stories like this one, where small acts of defiance changed everything. And tell us in the comments below, what's your hedgerow? What's the thing you're ready to cut through? Because somewhere, a new story is waiting to begin. One that might be told decades from now about someone who decided that the impossible was just another kind of challenge. The fields of Normandy are quiet now. The earth is soft again. The war is over. But the spirit that cut through it, that will never fade. The wind moves through the hedges. The light fades. And in the silence you can still hear it. The hum of an engine, the breath of courage, the whisper of an idea that refused to die. And with that, the story returns to silence. The same silence from which it began.